Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm being interviewed by Jay Brown. This is another archival interview, but not a very old one. This is from about 4 years ago, during the pandemic. Jay Brown has been practicing yoga for decades and has been teaching for over 25 years, primarily in the style of Desikachar, who, of course, doesn't so much teach a style, or I should say didn't so much teach a style, as a way of adapting the fundamentals of modern postural yoga to each individual. So, Jay is a great interviewer, and I think you will appreciate this conversation. He commented that he found a lot of wisdom in it, so I hope you will too.
Harish.
Hey, how are ya?
I'm doing okay, all things considered. How are you?
Great. Yeah, beautiful day here. Beautiful late summer day in Portugal. Well, it still feels like late summer.
Wow, you made a place for yourself in Portugal. I saw that. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty nice.
Well, we can get to that. First, just hello. I really thank you so much for making some time for me. I've been following you pretty closely since you were on the show in August 2016. It's been that long.
And yeah, wow.
And honestly, there's so many different things that I had in mind that I would want to talk to you about. It actually was kind of hard for me to figure out what I should talk to you today about. But to sort of give us a little bit of a beginning frame, I thought that I would just share with you that, before the pandemic and everything shut down, I think that I had really, moved a little bit in a direction towards, I don't know what you would call it, like a very pragmatic presentation of yoga.
Yeah.
Where it's about functional movement and just like being well in life more than like trying to do big complex poses.
Mm-hmm.
But for myself personally, like practice has always been a much more, I don't know, in my mind, a kind of mystical thing, kind of a spiritual path,
Mm-hmm.
And with the shutdown and everything that's happened, it's actually had an interesting effect where I've been returning to all these things that I had shied away from.
Mm-hmm.
Like for instance, just chanting, or like more poetry and more like emotional feeling involved in a way. I don't know how to say it. Or bhakti, maybe it's bhakti.
Yeah, totally.
And I think those were things that I found that like the market was kind of like frowning upon at one point. And I think I was trying to like meet the demands of the market or something.
Yeah.
And what I've realized in this time is that what I need most is that kind of more devotional space. And I see you as somebody who has always kind of had that kind of more bhakti element. I remember when you were on the show and we talked about your childhood and stuff, and even the difference between using the name Christopher and using the name Harish. I remember we talked about that. And I think that part of it has been that there was such a huge conversation around, cult dynamics in spiritual communities. And there were all these gurus who fell from grace, all these yoga masters who proved out to have abused people. And so I think that for me, part of the reason why there was a little bit of a move away from like bhakti elements is that's sort of seen as like a slippery slope. And so I'm real interested in finding that balance. Even just, you said you opened a retreat center in Portugal. You opened a compound in Portugal. Are we starting a cult? I don't think so, but you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I'm interested to talk to you about that balance that balance of having yoga practice have these devotional and other elements, I don't even know the right words to describe them, and having even teacher-student relationships that are conducive to like spiritual development.
Yeah.
And yet still not falling into these like patterns. I just had a range of conversations of people doing these reckonings with, abuses of power.
Yeah.
I think many of us are trying to sort through that. Like, what do we do with all these yoga masters who did this stuff? And what does it mean in terms of our practice going forward? And do we all have to become somatic movers, or can we still chant?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be terribly unfortunate if somebody confused devotionalism in general with being part of a cult of personality. Those are very different things. I mean, they can overlap, but there's no specific reason to suppose that, one leads to another. I mean, there's complexity to this issue for sure, because one could say that somebody with devotional tendencies is more likely to be devotional towards their teacher or teachers, and thus more likely to get embroiled in a cult of personality. But this would seem like common sense advice, what I'm about to say, and yet it's not so common, I suppose, that you can feel a lot of love and devotion for your teachers without sort of pinning your life to theirs, like your finances or your life decisions, who should you marry or where should you move or whatever. Like that's something that's historically happened in India, on the basis of a guru disciple paradigm in which the guru would only have a few dozen real students, serious students, and he would know them or she would know them intimately, and therefore often actually have good advice on their life decisions, because if you just have a few dozen students, you know them all really well. And that's not the modern paradigm, but somehow like that idea that the teacher is somebody to consult about your life decisions or somebody to pin your life to in some way, that's idea is still sort of around, and I think it is a detrimental idea. And there are plenty of people though that instinctively understand that you can have love and devotion towards someone that you feel has given you a lot in your life and for your life without sort of becoming karmically entangled, would be another way to say it, right? So I don't think and devotionalism, of course, is something that most of which is not concerned with one's teachers, right? It's a devotional approach to life. Bhakti is related to the word bhajana, and bhajana in Sanskrit means reverence or reverencing. And it's an attitude that we can adopt towards life, one of reverence, reverence for the practice, for the practices, for the scriptures, for the opportunities in your life, for the gifts of challenge for the gifts of obvious blessings as well as the disguised blessings we call challenges, and reverence towards the lineages that made these teachings and practices available, but also reverence towards nature, reverence towards love itself, towards aliveness, and this reverencing also can very much go hand in hand with a kind of poignant longing for the truth, longing for fulfillment, divine union, whatever, So these are two powerful aspects of the bhakti path, this practice of reverencing, or this attitude of reverencing, and then also acknowledging the sweet longing that we have for abiding in our true nature, or whether you call it divine union or something else. So that's the important part of this devotional aspect of the spiritual path, and none of that necessarily shades off into anything unsalutary, one might say, right?
Well, no, I don't think so. And that's where my question comes from. And it's exactly what you were saying, that I have felt this need to do this reverencing in a way that I haven't in the past. An example, like there's this one practice, this simple, like sort of side vinyasa movement that I've been doing. And for a while I was instructing it as like you're reaching for something on a top shelf. Like it was like this very functional kind of movement thing, just to keep it soft and easy, like not a stretch. And then more recently though, that has not been what I need. And what I've been doing instead is like hearing the sound of the wind through the trees, or envisioning that hawk I saw swooping through the air, like using imagery in ways that I never had. And it's because I need that. It fills me up in a way in the practice ritual that is vibrant and worthwhile. And that seems like something that I think I've associated that kind of reverencing with, like some of the, we all have to be careful that we're not getting taken in by abusive gurus. For some reason, like there's been a little bit of like, because there is a certain giving over or something, and you said you can be devotional to somebody without, giving your power over to them.
Yeah, well, I think here's the thing, is that when you feel this reverencing quality, when you feel this devotional quality, then you kind of feel, this is something like a heart opening. This is like a kind of more open-hearted state. And then there's this sort of natural fear that this open-hearted state could be dangerous vis-a-vis people who might, take advantage of your generosity, not just gurus, but, other humans in general. Mm-hmm. But that needn't be the case at all, right? Because the issue, the thing that puts you in danger with gurus or other humans is not open-heartedness, but lack of discernment. And for some reason, people conflate those very easily, but they're not the same. You can have this open-heartedness where you're open to receiving, and also that you're naturally giving, and that you feel this love or whatever. There's a flow of energy, but the lack of discernment is a whole different thing. It's like the assumption that for example, assuming a teacher embodies everything he teaches. Well, that's a lack of discernment to assume that, right? There's no reason to suspect somebody embodies everything they teach, because we often teach, as you must know, we teach what we're working on ourselves oftentimes, and we have insight into it, or we couldn't teach it. But we often teach that which we don't perfectly embody yet, but wish to. And so that lack of discernment is what puts us in danger. I don't think you have that, right? But I think you're rightly concerned about, more credulous folks out there who might be out there in your audience and who don't even realize they're more credulous. Of course, no one goes around thinking that they are credulous, right? But nonetheless, they might be if they don't realize the dangers of pedestalizing the teacher, for example.
Well, also, it does assume that someone comes to the teacher with the discernment already. And I guess they will need to if they're not going to be taken advantage of potentially. But I guess the other thing I'm seeing that I know that you wrote this not so long ago in one blog post of yours, and it's goes to the heart of one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, which was that you wrote that a corrupted person can still be a vehicle for like a healthy transmission. And that's like, it doesn't make sense to our brains. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at too, where there's this confusion of, well, there's things that I learned from somebody who I no longer feel I could fully support, let's say.
Right.
And then there's sort of a call sometimes out there, and maybe that's another conversation where it's almost as if because that person did these bad behaviors and hurt other people, maybe not you, that means that there's something corrupted about those teachings.
Right. But that's a wrong assumption, I would say, because the person is often just passing on what they've received, and the fact that the vehicle, right, the transmitter, is corrupted, if we're going to use that word, on his or her personality level or ethics level of their being, doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the value of the teachings themselves, which they're passing on. But maybe an even more useful way to frame this issue is to invoke the great philosopher William James from his book Varieties of Religious Experience, which I recommend, by the way, to anyone interested in spiritual experience. He said, our principle should be fruits, not roots, meaning to say, when we're looking at any given practice or even belief, we should ask, what are its fruits? What are its benefits? Is it efficacious? Is it life enhancing and life affirming and life transforming? These are the questions that matter, not where did it come from, because where it came from or where it seems to have come from, which are not the same, doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the potential efficacy of the practice. So I think for most people, practitioners, fruits not roots is a good principle to go by in general, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, if you're contemplating somehow entangling your life with that of the teacher, then you're going to want to examine their character. But in general, one shouldn't do that. Like, there's a principle in the Indian tradition, actually, of don't live too far from your teacher, but also don't live too close. Like, why would you entangle yourself in that way? Because people sometimes, and again, this is it's just a certain subset of the population, but they imagine that they want to imagine teacher as savior. So we see this in the community around certain types of gurus, like Amma or Sadguru, or mostly Indian gurus, but also sometimes Westerners, where the teacher is viewed as a savior, and therefore there's this whole kind of surrender yourself to the guru sort of principle, which makes no sense and looks utterly mad to other people. But would make sense if it were possible that a teacher could be a savior. But I would argue they can't. They can only be an effective pointer, or an ineffective one. But let's assume they're an effective pointer, a guide, a facilitator, and a pointer, and not in any way a savior. In fact, they can't even take one single step on the path for you, let alone bring you to enlightenment. And so if that's your clear discernment, then I think you also avoid quite a bit of trouble.
So is that what you just said, that a teacher can't just bestow it upon you in that way that we sometimes think of as a guru, is that a distinction between a teacher and a guru, or do you even make a distinction? Like sometimes they talk about someone who, like people talk about Nareem Karoli Baba, like he comes to them in their dreams and tells them what to do. And then there's other people who are teachers who someone has more experience than someone else, let's say, but there's a more mutual exchange or something.
Yeah, it's not even about mutuality, right? It's about the presence or absence of this false savior paradigm, you know. Now, here's a point of possible confusion that you just kind of pointed out, which is that when somebody's very devoted to a guru, then what we call in my tradition, the Shakti, the spiritual energy, also known as Kundalini, can take the form of the object of your devotion in a vision or a dream. And that leads people to the wrong conclusion that, like Neem Karoli Baba or Amachi or whoever, some guru came to me in a dream, like as if they in their personality self, entered your dream.
They astrally projected into your dream world.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Right. And there's agency there involved and that's a wrong understanding. I would say it's rather that the Shakti forms itself into the object of your devotion. It appears to you in that way because that's what's held centrally in your mind. And that's the same reason that, devotees of Christ have visions of Christ and devotees of Krishna have visions of Krishna and, not the other way around. But that's not proof. That's not actually proof that Jesus or Krishna, respectively, are the one and true only version of God. It's rather just that when the person is ready to receive some kind of, download, if you want to call it that, which is a real phenomenon, but it's likely to form itself into, again, the object of one's devotion. So that being said, right, that can lead us to wrongly conclude that there's some truth to the savior paradigm when I would argue that there isn't, that an actual teacher-student relationship, that's one where there is mutuality in terms of communication. Right.
I guess that's what I meant. That like, it isn't like I just bow at your feet and you tap my forehead and there's Shaktipat or something, that I can ask you a question more like I would ask of a friend in a way, even if there is I'm thinking of you with respect and not like my buddy, but like somebody I respect who has information that I don't have or experience that I don't have, but I can speak to you in a way that feels more like on a person to person level. There isn't like a hierarchy where I can't speak to you.
Yeah. In fact, I would like to invoke the phrase Kalyana Mitra, which often gets translated spiritual friend. Literally actually means beautiful friend, Kalyana Mitra. And that's a Sanskrit phrase. And, this is a much kind of healthier orientation that your teacher, even the phrase my teacher is already kind of too emotionally charged in a way, right? That your teacher can be like your spiritual friend.
And then maybe the reverse is true, like my students as well. Is that problematic when someone says my students, just like someone says my teacher?
Yeah, I think this emphasis, we can feel in discourse also this lean on the possessive pronoun, like my teacher can be said with a tone that makes it clear that it is equivalent to guru, even though they're avoiding the word guru, right? But also the possessiveness of it is, I think, problematic. I think it's problematic in all respects, because we also say my husband, my wife, my partner. It's this possessive, and in English we have no easy equivalent to that doesn't express possession, which itself is kind of disturbing, the way we incorporate the possessed person, the person that we see ourselves as possessing with the my, we incorporate them into our ego structure in some way, right? So if the, we also set ourselves up for a fall, as well as setting the teacher up for a fall, because, wanting to idealize the teacher, and then some disillusionment comes, and the disillusionment is painful in precise proportion to how much, the person was both idealizing and possessive of the teacher figure. And so I'm invoking this paradigm of spiritual friend, sort of walking the path, a few steps ahead of you, let's say, not in any hierarchical sense, but just in the sense that they have literally been practicing longer, have had insights you haven't yet had, or, can point out things you haven't yet seen, but without needing to kind of invoke a hierarchy in which they are higher, but just like the very simple thing we do with humans in general is like, oh, you've eaten at that restaurant. I haven't. Let me ask you what it's like. Oh, you've done these practices. You've walked this path. And I'm open to that, receiving support on that basis. And that would be enough. That would be enough to explain the whole paradigm of the teacher-student relationship, except that, of course, it's also possible that with certain teachers that they have not only walked the path longer than you, but it's also possible that they've shifted into a different paradigm of existence that we call awakeness, or, commonly known as enlightenment, but that's a very problematic word for various reasons. And the problem with understanding this is that it's not necessarily just a binary shift, where like suddenly somebody pops over into this other paradigm, because the other paradigm of existence has many kind of dimensions to it, just like normal human existence does. And the person might have woken up to certain aspects of that paradigm, but not all of them. And this is something that as soon as we start talking about this, people get a little nervous.
I just did. I was like, whoa, shift of, I like this phrase, a shifting of paradigm of existence. I'm curious because that did send off like a little bit of like a concern alarm, like, ooh, shifting, like that some people have accomplished this shift and other people haven't. Or what is this? How is it relative? Like, are there like different kind of, not levels, but like gradations of this shift? Or is it like now I've come into awakening and I can see my past lives, or not that I think it means that, but
no, yeah. There's many, many, many aspects to it, some of which might be realized and some of which might not be. But it's not that big of a deal. I'll try to describe it a little bit more so that we're clear.
It's not that big of a deal. I like that.
It really isn't. It isn't, because this paradigm shift, it's a possibility that exists within human consciousness, that exists within human physiology, I would even say. I have no argument with the neurologists who say, well, this is actually a neurological shift where the pattern of wiring in your brain has shifted, and the pattern of a kind of that the electrical currents trace out through your cortex, and that it's shifted in some way. Like I'm not, of course, an expert in that area, but I'm just saying I have no argument with that perspective on it. That we don't need to understand it mystically. We can understand it as a kind of shift in neurological function that introduces us to a different paradigm of being. And I'll just speak, on the basis of my own experience, because I can't really speak authoritatively to aspects of it that I haven't experienced. But for me, it's a shift. And again, I don't claim it's complete in any way, but it was a shift from subject-object duality, where the world confronted me as something other. There's me and there's the world, and it's almost a sense of me versus the world. I got to conquer, I got to accomplish, I got to achieve things in life, and I got to avoid the bad things, and try to win this game and try to navigate this world of objects and people and dangers and so on. A shift out of that paradigm completely and into this other paradigm whereby there is no subject-object distinction, meaning to say, everything that I perceive is internal to consciousness, and therefore internal to what I am, because I experience myself as consciousness. So it's hard to describe, but it's almost as if everything shifted such that instead of seeing objects outside myself, everything I'm seeing is inside myself. And what I just thought before that I was just a mind and a body, and then I came to see that I was consciousness, and everything I perceive is internal to consciousness. So it's part of what I am. But there's no special priority to me, quote unquote, me, right? Because I understand that from everyone's point of view, they can see the same exact reality from their point of view, that everything is internal to consciousness from their point of view, right? So it's no specialness about me, right? Mm-hmm. It's just a perception of everything being not only internal to consciousness, but made of consciousness, had the result in my life of making me feel I'm at home wherever I am, and I can relax and truly go with the flow, not just in the sense of doing what I like, but in the sense of surrendering to the natural currents of life. And this profound feeling that there's nothing I need to run away from and nothing I need to chase after, because everything already is what I am. Which, when you put it in language, it can sound mystical, but it's really not very mystical. It's really just a different paradigm.
Yeah, no, and that's what I mean. Like, I often use the word mystical with a little hesitation, because there is sort of associations with that word, as though it's not just that it's a big deal rather than not a big deal. But I appreciate what you're talking about, because, sometimes it's difficult to talk about, and I would never use it as a word, enlightenment, because as you said, that word has a lot of associations around it. But there is sort of what you were just describing, this, I've often just for myself called it like okayness, like I'm totally okay regardless of all of it, Mm-hmm. Like there's like an underlying baseline feeling that makes me, like you say, feel like I'm less subject to all of this turmoil or injustice or something. Like,
right, exactly. So that's part of this paradigm of awakeness, and you might have accessed that aspect, because again, like I said, there's a bunch of different aspects, and one of them is the sense of fundamental okayness that is not violated or undone by anything. So when you're in touch with that, you can have some challenge arise, you can have some shocking event happen in your life, and there's this level of our own being, our own consciousness, which feels this profound sense of everything is okay, even when it's not.
Yeah, I can be feeling really like emotionally sad, or like not feeling good at all, or not happy at all, but still have an underlying sense that I'm okay underneath it all or something.
Yeah. And, I do want to kind of just signal that, there's a kind of issue that gets raised at this point in the conversation sometimes around privilege, like somebody saying, easy for you guys to say, a couple of well-off white guys or whatever.
I was just thinking that. I was like, it's easy for us to feel okay, isn't it? That's exactly what went to my mind, because that would be the pushback, right? Like,
and it's a perfectly valid pushback, except that the proposition here for people to check in their own direct experience is that what we're actually talking about is an aspect of consciousness itself. So everybody can access that. And in terms of people of less privilege, I often see it and experience it in older indigenous women, for example, that they have access in various cultures, India and South America and different places. I've seen the older indigenous women have access to this fundamental sense of okayness that enables them to weather kind of truly amazing storms in life, and they don't necessarily talk about it. It's like, perhaps that's really what's different in our demographic, is that we perhaps brag about having access to this that is actually just apparent to wisdom elders of indigenous traditions, and not something they need to even talk about.
That seems true, that a lot of times the people who have access to this most don't feel compelled to talk about it a lot. They just sort of are models or examples, and they rub off on you.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Exactly.
But I also think there's those of us, I think you, and I'm going to put me in the same boat, who are also whatever more like the intellectual consideration of these things as well. Find that stimulating. I think we might have even talked about that in terms of like scholar practitioner and how they feed off of each other last time you were here, if I recall. I guess my question now has to do with, the stuff that we're talking about, this shift of perspective or of existence, not of just perspective, of existence, you said, and the way that gets transmitted. You said earlier that like in the older days, they tended to be like, teachers didn't have as many students around them. And there is a kind of thing in our modern cultures of like scale and things getting really big and standardized. And I've always been feeling like, well, that some of what's been happening now is kind of, since so much has been shut down, there has been like a return a little bit to like living rooms and basements and stuff. And I'm wondering, do you think that if it gets too big around a teacher, that inherent, like that becomes a problem, or that's when these kind of institutions get formed around somebody?
Yeah, it becomes a problem if the culture in an organization is overly focused on the teacher, and it needn't be. I try to encourage people to focus on the teachings rather than the teacher, because really there's nothing special about the teacher except his or her skill in pointing things out or explicating. Like, their pedagogical skill matters, of course, but there's nothing else special about them, and even if there is, it's not salutary for the student to kind of focus too much attention on the teacher, right? So the teachings deserve our reverence, I would say, not the teacher. In fact, there's a way in which people love interpersonal drama of various kinds, whether it's love or hate or both, and that can be a distraction from the serious business and the challenging business of really focusing on the teachings and putting them to work in your life and challenging yourself to live by them. And it's in a way easier to get caught up in cults of personality. And that is what we see happen in all these kind of large scale organizations that are focused on one teacher. What I'm hoping to do in my own organization is, bring in other faculty that help to mitigate that problem of too much focus on one person,
Or at least there has to be some way. I was just talking about this on the show last week about there's got to be a way for someone who can hold the teacher accountable in some way, that if there's just a teacher at top and everything below that, but there's no one to the side of the teacher who could also hold that teacher's feet to the fire or hold them to account if they do fall into pitfalls.
Yes.
That it can't just be that it can't just be the students have to be discerning. There has to be a way that teachers have to take responsibility and be held to account for when they don't.
Yes, and the students shouldn't have to do that, right? The people to do that are the peers of that teacher. And so I would say, look out for any teacher who doesn't openly admit that they have peers, because that's probably a dangerously deluded person. Because a teacher should be able to admit they have mentors and peers, and their mentors or peers are the ones who hold them accountable, so that their students don't have to worry about that. That's an added burden on the student. Yes, we want students to have discernment, of course, but they shouldn't be kind of vested with the obligation of having to hold their teachers accountable. Other people need to be doing that.
Right, especially when there's larger scale and a big institution around them. There has to be something in place. That's where everything went wrong, because there were these huge institutions around people and no way to hold that highest person accountable.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing I'm thinking about in terms of this shift in paradigm of existence, you wrote about this quite recently, if I recall, that there's sometimes an assumption, and maybe even I've had this assumption too, that it means that teacher would manifest as kindness or something. Like, at the end of every one of these shows that I've done, I think I'm at almost 250 now in a row, I always ask everybody to be kind, because it's always been a big key for me, just in terms of coming from a heart place. And yet I saw you writing about like analoma and pratiloma, and how some teachers come as kindness, and there's also that kind of teacher who comes as more of like some kind of tough love.
Right.
And I think some people have come to think of that teacher who has like tough love as abusive.
Right. And the key difference, of course, being that a teacher who's abusive is using people for their own ends, in self-interest. And a teacher who's practicing pratiloma, this sort of intensity or tough love or wake the fuck up kind of method of teaching, that person is acting for the benefit of the student, and that is going to be clear to a large number of observers, if not the student themselves at first, right? And then it becomes clear. It should be relatively clear that the teacher is utilizing a little bit of tough love for the benefit of the student, and that's totally different from excusing the teacher's self-interested behaviors as that, because they're totally different.
I guess I hear what you're saying. I appreciate that. And I imagine there's also a way to confront someone on a difficult thing in a way that is confronting, but still kind, not mean. You don't have to be mean about it.
Correct. Yes. In other words, like tough, but not mean,
Yes. And I guess there's so much stuff that gets mixed in sometimes, I've been having these conversations with Iyengar teachers of late, and just because that's sometimes a style of teaching in a way where someone would even just yell at someone across the room, "Hey, your foot's not turned out." And like, there's kind of like a somatic dominance to that in a way. Some people take that as what you're saying is like a pratiloma, and some people take that as just them being a dick, or
exactly. But in the Indian tradition, there is precedence for this that Westerners aren't necessarily familiar with, which is that when the teacher yells at you or something, it's an opportunity, and this is understood going way back, it's an opportunity to check your own ego, because if you get all offended and riled up and everything, that's a sign that your ego is still, kind of an issue. And if you don't take it personally, then that's a sign that you're becoming, psychically soft and supple and malleable and everything. It doesn't mean that you don't stand up for yourself, because what we're talking about is whether it's personal or not, right? So there's a huge difference between a teacher saying, "Whoa, hey, look at what you're doing there. You're out of alignment, physically or otherwise," and actually just verbally kind of running you down in front of other students and making you feel bad. You know what I mean? There's a dip, and these differences are fairly clearly apparent on a kind of energetic level to some people, certainly to me, but very difficult to talk about in words in terms of like, there's no rule you can apply that will always verify when it's a beneficial opportunity to, dissolve some of your ego structure, some of your often sensitivity, I like to call it, or whether it's a moment where, you need to actually give feedback to the teacher and say, hey, if this is a pedagogical strategy right here, it's not working on me. I'm just turning away from you. I've even told, some of I almost always just go with the loving approach, by the way, with my own students, because that's what feels right to me. Yeah. But occasionally I'll get firm. Occasionally I'll get really firm with someone who's exhibiting the same pattern over and over and over again. And I'll be like, what the fuck are you doing? You're just doing the same thing again that hurt yourself before, and I'll try to give them a wake up call, let's say. And sometimes, if somebody says, oh, that was a little harsh, I'll say, look, I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to support. You can take what I said, sit with it, come back to me and tell me if it actually feels beneficial or if my pedagogy is off the mark, if I'm not using the right strategy with you. You can tell me that. And I think that's important.
I think that seems to be a pretty big key. I guess that was going to be my question. I just had people on talking about TKV Desikachar and how a lot of his teaching was sort of more like you're describing, sometimes very mischievous, sometimes kind of firm, like mirroring of ego stuff, and I think that's interesting. But my question was, do we run into risky territory when Westerners try to take that on? You gave us an example of when you might do that with someone. I could see that. I guess that would require some kind of foundation of relationship and trust between you two.
Yes, of course, yes.
You wouldn't want to be some stranger you just start. You wouldn't do that to a stranger, I don't imagine, because like you said, the loving tone tends to be much more effective than like a harsh disciplinarian from the outside. At least that's always been the case for me.
It is up until it becomes enabling, you know what I mean? As parents know with teenagers, it's like, at what point is unconditional love feel like not an effective strategy?
That's funny though. Unconditional love, not an effective strategy. That's true, because sometimes you have unconditional love, but it's not a strategy. It's just a fact.
Right. But the expression of it, like from a teacher-student relationship or a parent-child relationship, the expression of unconditional love might not be the best thing in that moment, even if you might still feel the unconditional love, but that, expressing that might have become a kind of enabling of the bad habits of that person. But this is only assuming the context of someone who's signed up, for guidance, right? This is it. What I've done in the past, to my embarrassment, is I've gotten so used to the teacher role that I adopt it even with those who haven't declared themselves my student, and I came to realize, that's totally inappropriate, and also kind of something that I was doing almost out of insecurity. Like, I'd gotten so used to that role. If I'm not in that role, then how do I relate to this person? It's like, I need to negotiate the feeling of awkwardness. I need to negotiate, I don't know how to relate to this person. I don't know what role we are to each other, and that's okay. And to only adopt pedagogical strategies with those who have specifically asked me to do so.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's sometimes I've had that experience too, where you're asserting yourself as a teacher with someone who hasn't necessarily asked you to do that yet, because I always felt that was like my job. I'm supposed to do that. But in a way, at a certain point, I got clearer on what I think my role is more. Like you were saying, even just a pointer or facilitator more than like, oh, it's my job to assert myself as a teacher with everybody who walks in the room. And I guess there is a certain assertion because I'm the one facing this direction and other people are facing another direction, at least when we get out of the pandemic or even still through the Zoom meetings.
Sure.
There's still that dynamic of taking on a role of being a teacher. But I guess there's these subtle variations of how that dynamic plays out. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah. And I think the subtle variation that's most important is that, people who haven't yet declared as students, you're just offering something on a kind of open palm, oh, here, try this if you like, it's an offering. And with those who are in the student position, have asked for, they want to be told when they have a blind spot, and they're open to, being spoken to a little bit more sharply if that's what's needed to get them out of their kind of daze. Because we get into these a kind of trance with spiritual practice or somatic practice sometimes, and or with our belief systems, But that kind of hey, wake up thing is not. It just comes across as condescending to someone who hasn't adopted the role of student,
And I guess that's sort of like, even from where we started, something that's been happening is that I don't have the same dynamic of like always new people coming into class where you feel like you're maybe ingratiating them in some way. That right now I have just groups of people who've been practicing with me for like years at a time. And there's something that happens when there is kind of an established, where someone's just decided to come to my class on a regular for like more than a year, there's something that develops. And I've heard you write about this too, where there are times as a teacher where like you use this word download or something, where there's kind of inspired moments of clarity in words that I can't always explain.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's what I call the guru principle, right? Or not just me, the tradition calls it the guru principle, where according to one branch of the tantric tradition anyway, the guru is a kind of power of transmission. It's not a person. It was never a person. It's not some primordial person that you're channeling. It's not, or it's not a god either. That it's this power of transmission that happens when a student is open and ready and sort of ripe, you might say, to receive. And you're in a sufficiently centered place, but also in a sufficiently self-negating place, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. If you're not all up in your identity as a teacher, but you're just open to supporting and the student's open to receiving, suddenly something comes through that is wiser than you are. Like, where is that coming from? That's one of the great mysteries of existence. I think scientists should be studying this because it's a real phenomenon for sure.
Yes, but you see, that real phenomenon is the hardest thing to put words to in a way, or hardest thing to, it's real. And I think most teachers who've been at it for a long time have some degree of that experience.
Yes.
But that's what I call where we are tapping into something more mystical, or like, are we, I don't like that word channeling, always feels so cheesy. Like, what are voices coming through? What these transmissions, where do they come from? Do we know? Does it matter?
Well, the tantric tradition has an answer for this. It's not, well, I'll just give the answer that the tradition offers, which is, there is something called paravak, which means the supreme word. But here, word means something like pattern, like deep structure of existence. Word means something like it does in the beginning of the Gospel of John in the Christian tradition, when it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Well, there's a deeper meaning to the word there, right? And in the same way with paravak, it means something like a supreme or ultimate pattern or fundamental deep structure of existence. And that there's this patterning, we could call it even innate intelligence of existence, but the intelligence doesn't belong to someone, like some supernatural being named God or whatever. The intelligence belongs to the whole universe, not to a person. Mm-hmm. And this intelligent patterning of existence is something that we can somehow tap into. And that's actually what we're channeling. And it's magical when it can sort of clothe itself in words and spill out our mouths, and you feel that when it's really happening, because the students' eyes get wide, or they kind of gasp, or you can feel it landing in their heart. But you yourself are also momentarily awed, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be such a big deal. It could be a little moment of wisdom, but you yourself are also like, whoa. Yeah, I need to be taking notes too.
Absolutely. I've had it happen of late, these intimate, like Zoom, believe it or not, these Zoom yoga classes, just because people are coming with such an intensity of, engagement or something. And then I'll say things and they are the right thing to say. And I could never have planned to say those things or something. And afterwards, I actually feel like there's like a recovery time or something. Like I have like, I gotta come down. I can't just like jump into other things. There's a visceral feeling of it. And I'm acknowledging to myself, like you said, that is actually a real thing. That's not bullshit or like some like, arty farty talk of me trying to like get money from people or something. That's, that's me having an experience and saying, wow, that's a real experience. And then, like you said, I think that's some of what gets pointed to in these yogic texts I've been reading over the years.
Of course, absolutely. And we just tend to be skeptical. People in general tend to be skeptical of anything that isn't found in their everyday language. And that shows us how language conditions our brains so deeply that if we're just talking about anything that there's not a common English word for, then people are like, I don't know about that, but we're like, no, it's a real thing. It just doesn't initially seem that way to you because you don't have a word for it, and language conditions your brain, and it's frustrating, of course, this fact, we need to go beyond what language predisposes us to believe if we're going to encompass reality with our being, you know what I mean? Because the reality is more than what language predisposes us to believe.
Isn't that the truth? Man, and I guess that's like, with everything that's been going on too, it comes down to some question, and I've heard you talk about this some too, about like intuition and whether or not someone could, I know you've written about it as like, can you be your own guru? And it's one of yours, like, what do you call them? Like near enemies to the truth, right? And so I've been feeling like a lot of times these days, just to bring it more to a practical level, there's like all this confusing information, even right now, surge of cases, and we're going to shut down again. And I'm reading my own, reading scientists, all kinds of scientists and epidemiologists, and it is quite confusing. There's contradictory information. There's all this politics in the way. And so at a certain point, I have to make a decision from like some place inside me. And I think of that more as like an intuitive place. Of course, it's informed by my kind of reading and informing myself about things, but ultimately there's a place of knowing in myself that I have to come from. And I've always thought of that as like Sat Guru, like that's the guru in me. That's the ultimate guru. But I've heard you kind of maybe raise alarms about that kind of idea.
Oh, no. It's just what I raise alarms about is the notion that, I don't need teachers because I'm my own teacher, whereas I would say the reason it's a near enemy to the truth is because in one deep sense, you are your own guru because you decide which teachers to approach, how long to spend with them, when to leave them. Ultimately the buck stops with you. It has to. But when we think, oh, I can walk the spiritual path without humbling myself and without learning from somebody else, then that's just a kind of ego delusion, right? But of course, I don't mean to imply otherwise. You have to empower yourself to choose who to work with, how and for how long it's beneficial, and when something seems to be off, empower yourself to step back from that teacher-student relationship and to be there only as long as it feels right. So in that sense, yeah, your intuition is the guiding light, and the name for it in Sanskrit is not Satguru, it's Pratibha, which means in which Pratibha is intuitive insight or embodied wisdom, but it etymologically means shining towards, meaning to say, when you turn one direction, you feel a kind of glow, and that's the right way for me to go. You turn in another direction, you feel less of the glow or the softening or the opening or the inner yes. And then that's not the direction to go, and you feel less of that, right? So the inner intuition is absolutely sovereign. It has to be sovereign. So in that sense, you are your own guru. But you're part of what the inner intuition will lead you to is learning from others.
Yeah, and people know stuff that you don't know and have an experience that you haven't had, and they can be really helpful.
Exactly. It doesn't have anything to do with submitting yourself to somebody else. It's just like being humble enough to realize I'm going to save a lot of time and trouble if I learn from those who have something to share. Mm-hmm. And one of the fundamental things, just to come finish that topic, is if you sit with somebody, as I have, with several somebodies who experiences this alternative paradigm for existence, you become convinced, oh, it's really possible. This is really a thing. Mm-hmm. And some people awaken to this alternative paradigm without first meeting someone who has, but it's quite rare. Most of the time you meet someone who has, and you pick it up from them, and you're like, whoa, wait a second. They're not just believing different beliefs than me. They're actually inhabiting a different paradigm of existence. And when you feel that viscerally in their everything, in what they're transmitting and so on, then you open to that possibility for yourself. And I would say, this is a kind of radical idea, but this whole enlightenment thing, it's really fundamentally a relatively simple paradigm shift that anyone can go through if they want to, but it has been overblown, mythologized, and aggrandized beyond all possible belief for economic reasons and for power reasons, meaning to say, by selling the myth of enlightenment as this big deal of mega wisdom or whatever, it's enabled people to leverage power over others, economic and otherwise, charismatic power as well. And so part of what I want to do with the next years of my career is kind of argue for the fact that awakening, even though it can be a very dramatic paradigm shift, it's also, in some sense, nothing special, and certainly nothing that should be mythologized and put out of reach. It's rather something available to anyone who cares to kind of make it a priority, Well,
I love what you said at the beginning. You're like, it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah,
I think that's a really good way to take off the mythologizing around it and have it go from being like some idea of supernatural to just being natural. That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And when people make it a big deal, they push it away from themselves. So that's it's not worthwhile. And there's no reason that that should be people's goal and involved in yoga. Of course, you can be involved in yoga for any reason that's worthwhile to you.
Well, that actually takes me to what I was just about to ask you, because you wrote about the misalignment of view, practice, and fruit. And I thought that was a pretty significant and important idea. And that's what you just got to. You were just saying like, oh, this doesn't feel right, I'll go in that direction. And this idea of view, practice, and fruit, maybe you could say a little something about that for us.
Yeah. One of the most important teachings from the Tantra tradition, which is still not really understood in the wider yoga world at all, which is that first you need to clarify your aspiration. What are you actually going for in your practice? And then you need to ensure that your practice is aligned with that goal or aspiration, right? That's what we call fruit, is the goal, right? So your practice has to be aligned with it, meaning to say, if you want health, if you want to feel healthy in your body and you want to feel good in your body, well, there's certain types of practice that better align with that goal than other types. And by contrast, if you want, spiritual awakening, then a different practice is indicated than the one indicated for primarily health and well-being. There can be overlap, and there is, but still there's a different practice depending on the goal, a different emphasis in practice, assuming you don't have 10 hours a day to practice, there's going to be a different emphasis. And so you make sure practice and fruit are aligned, that the practice aligns with the goal. And for that, we often need to consult with teachers. Like, hey, do you think the practice I'm doing will lead to the goal that I've set for myself? And they give you feedback. That's part of what the best thing a teacher can do for you.
I guess that aspiration has to be clear. Like that's...
Yes. Yeah. That's clear, simple aspiration. Yeah. And it doesn't work to say, oh, enlightenment, right? Because then the teacher, if they're worth their salt, is going to say, wait a second, what do you mean by enlightenment? We need to pin this down. What are you going for in your practice? So if you were to say something more real, like, I want profound inner peace, or I want a clear mind. I want to no longer be tortured by my mind. I want clarity of mind and peace of mind. That's actionable. We can say, okay, this type of meditation is what's going to help you actualize that goal. Whereas if you just say something vague, like liberation or enlightenment, then it's not actionable enough,
Yes. And then
the last
go ahead.
The last piece, because we said alignment of view, practice, and fruit, right? So the last piece is view, which means to say, are you embracing a philosophy, a spiritual philosophy that aligns with and empowers the practice, which also aligns with the goal? And so if people don't have a sufficiently strong view, then they might be doubting their own practice while they're doing it and disempowering it, undermining it. So you need a belief system, even though you're going to later shed belief system altogether. In the meantime, you need a belief system that empowers your practice. And that's alignment of view, practice, and fruit.
That makes sense. I've always thought of that as like, there's a context for practice that's either conducive to your purpose in it or not. And sometimes people have a purpose and then they're practicing in a context that's actually contrary to their purpose, which is what it seems like you're talking about. And then I think the test is the fruit. Like, is it working? Is it leading you in the direction that you want to go?
Yes.
I'm trying to sort that out. And I guess that's where sometimes teachers are helpful, because they sometimes mirror things where you can better see if that's the case or not.
Yeah, they can see it often more clearly. Oh, you're not having an alignment of your view, practice, and fruit here. So it's not going to gel, until there has to be that alignment. Some people just develop it instinctively, but a lot of people need feedback on that.
Well, Harish, this has been immensely fun, and thank you. I've just appreciated this kind of messy probe of, not messy, but just like some murky areas, because These are the things that I'm fleshing out, and I feel like it's been helpful to hear you speak to them. I really appreciate it.
Sure, great. Yeah, and thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
Oh, it was a pleasure, Harish. Take care. I'll be in touch.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.